After I gave them everything, they locked me out, my daughter-in-law said from the other side of the door, her voice calm, almost bored, as if she were reminding me to take out the trash instead of erasing me from my own home. And I stood there on the front porch with the porch light buzzing faintly above me, staring at the brass handle that no longer turned for me, my suitcase sitting upright beside my feet like it had been waiting longer than I had, and for a moment, I thought maybe this was a misunderstanding, maybe Daniel had forgotten to tell her something, maybe there had been some mistake with the locks, but I lifted my hand toward the door and then stopped, because something in the silence on the other side felt deliberate, heavy, final, and I lowered my hand again without knocking. I didn't knock, I didn't call out his name, I didn't ask to be let back in, I just stood there and listened, and what I heard was nothing, no footsteps, no hesitation, no guilt, just the quiet hum of a house that had already decided it no longer belonged to me. And that was when I realized this hadn't happened in a single moment. It hadn't started tonight with a locked door and a suitcase on the porch. It had been building slowly, quietly, in the spaces between conversations, in the way Ashley had started smiling at me without warmth, in the way Daniel had stopped meeting my eyes across the dinner table, in the way decisions about the house were made without ever including me, even though my name was still on the paperwork, even though I had been the one who paid the down payment, the one who covered the mortgage when Daniel lost his job 5 years ago, the one who watched their children every afternoon so they could build their careers without worrying about childcare. I had given them everything, not in one grand gesture, but in 1,000 small ones, checks written quietly, meals cooked without thanks, nights spent rocking a crying baby so they could sleep, and I never kept score because that's what you do when you love your family, you give, and you trust that love will come back to you in its own way. But standing there on that porch, with the night air settling into my bones and the suitcase at my side, I understood that love had been replaced by something else, something colder, something calculated, and I thought about the dinner 2 nights earlier, how Ashley had insisted we all sit together, how she had poured wine with a careful smile, how Daniel had barely spoken, how they had exchanged glances I pretended not to notice, and I remembered the way she said, "We should start thinking about what's best for everyone," as if I were a problem to be solved, not a person who had built that home from the ground up. And I remembered how Daniel nodded without looking at me, how he traced the rim of his glass like he was trying to avoid saying something out loud, and I had told myself I was imagining things, that families go through phases, that maybe they were just stressed, that maybe I was being too sensitive, but now, with the door locked and no one answering, there was no room left for doubt. This had been planned, every step of it. Down to the suitcase placed neatly outside as if they had packed me up along with my things, and I felt something inside me settle, not break, not shatter, just settle into a quiet, steady understanding, and I picked up the handle of the suitcase, feeling its familiar weight in my hand, and I turned away from the door without looking back, because whatever was waiting for me next, it wasn't behind that door anymore. I did not go far that night. Not because I did not know where to go, but because I needed a moment to understand what had just happened. So I walked to the end of the driveway and stopped beneath the old maple tree that Daniel and I had planted together when he was 8 years old, back when his hands were small and he still believed I could fix anything, and I stood there with my suitcase beside me, listening to the quiet neighborhood, the distant sound of a car passing, the soft rustle of leaves. And I realized how strange it was that everything else in the world kept moving as if nothing had changed, as if a life had not just been quietly removed from its place, and I took a slow breath, feeling the cool night air settle into my chest, steady and grounding, and I told myself to think clearly, not emotionally, because emotion had no place here anymore, not after the way they had done this, not after the silence behind that door. So I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, staring at Daniel's name on the screen for a long moment before pressing call, and I listened as it rang once, twice, 3 times, until it went to voicemail, his recorded voice cheerful and distant, telling me to leave a message, and I did not. I ended the call without speaking, then I tried again, and again there was no answer, and that was when it settled deeper, heavier. This was not confusion, this was not a mistake, this was a decision they had both agreed to. And I thought about the small things I had ignored over the past few months, the way Ashley had started reorganizing the house without asking me, moving my things from the kitchen shelves to the back of cabinets, the way she had taken over conversations about bills and expenses, speaking as if everything already belonged to her. The way Daniel had begun saying things like our house instead of your house when he talked to friends on the phone. And I remembered the afternoon I found the spare key missing from the drawer. How Ashley had smiled and said she must have misplaced it, how I had nodded and let it go, because I trusted her, because I trusted him, because it never occurred to me that trust could be used like this, quietly, patiently, until one day there was nothing left for me to hold on to, and I looked back at the house from where I stood, the windows glowing softly, warm light spilling out into the darkness, and for a brief moment I imagined walking back, knocking on the door, forcing a conversation, demanding answers, but the thought passed as quickly as it came, because I already had my answer. It was in the locked door, in the unanswered calls, in the suitcase placed neatly outside as if I had already been erased from the inside. And I adjusted my grip on the handle, feeling its weight steady in my hand, and I turned away from the house again, this time with more certainty, because whatever they believed they had taken from me, they had not taken my ability to walk away on my own terms. And as I stepped off the curb and onto the sidewalk, I began to think not about what I had lost, but about what I still had, and more importantly, what they thought I no longer did. By the time I reached the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, the house was no longer visible, but the weight of it stayed with me, not the walls or the furniture, but the years I had poured into it, the quiet routines, the morning coffee at the kitchen window, the sound of my grandson's laughter echoing down the hallway, all of it now sealed behind a door that no longer opened for me, and I kept walking, steady, deliberate, my steps even against the pavement, because stopping would have meant feeling too much, and feeling too much would have made me question something I already understood. So instead I let my mind move backward, not to dwell, but to examine, to piece together the pattern I had ignored for far too long. And I thought about the afternoon Ashley insisted on handling the property tax payment, how she said it would be easier if everything went through her online account, how Daniel had nodded beside her without even glancing at me, and I remembered the day a letter from the bank arrived addressed only to him, not to me, even though my name had always been on every account. How I had held that envelope for a moment longer than necessary before setting it down unopened on the counter, telling myself it was nothing, that families change, that roles shift over time, but now those moments lined up clearly, one after another, forming something I could no longer deny, and I felt a strange clarity settle in, not anger, not even sadness, just a quiet awareness that I had been slowly moved out of my own life long before they locked that door. And as I reached the bus stop at the end of the block, I set my suitcase down beside the bench and sat carefully, folding my hands in my lap the way I had done 1,000 times before at dinner tables, waiting rooms, school events, always patient, always composed, and I looked down at my phone again, not to call this time, but to scroll, to check something I had not looked at in months, my bank account, and when the screen loaded, I studied the numbers, the transfers, the small shifts that had seemed insignificant at the time but now carried a different meaning, and I could see where money had been redirected, where control had been subtly adjusted, where access had been narrowed, not all at once, but gradually, carefully, until I was no longer at the center of anything, and I let out a slow breath, not in defeat, but in understanding, because what they did not realize, what they never thought to question, was that I had never been careless, not with my life, not with my home, and certainly not with my finances. And as I closed the banking app and slipped the phone back into my purse, I felt something shift again, something firmer this time, more defined. And when the headlights of an approaching car swept across the street, briefly illuminating the quiet bus stop and the suitcase at my side, I straightened my back and lifted my chin slightly, because this was no longer about what they had taken. It was about what they believed they had already won, and for the first time since I stepped away from that door, I allowed myself the smallest hint of a smile, not warm, not forgiving, but certain, because they had locked me out of the house, but they had no idea what they had just locked themselves out of. The bus arrived 10 minutes later, its headlights cutting through the quiet street as it pulled up with a low mechanical sigh, and I stood, lifting my suitcase with a steady hand before stepping inside, the driver giving me a brief nod as I dropped a few bills into the fare box, the familiar routine grounding me in a way I had not expected, and I chose a seat near the middle, setting the suitcase beside me, keeping one hand resting lightly on the handle as if to remind myself that I still had control over something. And as the bus began to move, The neighborhood slid past the window in slow, familiar frames, the same houses, the same sidewalks, everything unchanged except for the fact that I was no longer part of it, and I watched without emotion, letting the distance grow, because distance was necessary now, not just physical, but mental, and I let my thoughts return to the details I had uncovered, the small financial shifts, the subtle transfers, the quiet consolidation of control, and I began to connect them more clearly, more precisely, like pieces of a puzzle finally forming a complete picture. And I remembered the afternoon 6 months ago when Ashley had insisted that Daniel should handle the insurance paperwork, how she had said it was more efficient that way, how she had smiled at me with that same polite expression that never quite reached her eyes, and I had agreed without question, because I believed in keeping peace, in trusting family, but now I understood that efficiency had never been the goal, control had been. And I thought about the joint account that had slowly become less active on my end, how I had started receiving fewer statements, how online access had been changed under the explanation of upgrading security, and how I had accepted it all without resistance, not because I was unaware, but because I chose to believe that intentions were good, and that choice, I realized now, had been my only mistake, not a weakness, just a decision to trust the wrong people. And as the bus turned onto the main road, the streetlights passing in steady intervals, I straightened slightly in my seat, my mind no longer circling the loss, but moving forward, because there was one thing I had not checked yet, one thing I had deliberately left untouched until now, and that was the account they did not know about, the one I had opened years ago, long before Ashley entered our lives, back when Daniel was still learning how to balance his first paycheck, back when I still believed that planning ahead was simply part of being responsible, not a necessity for survival. And I reached into my purse again, pulling out my phone, the screen lighting up softly in the dim bus interior as I entered the familiar login information, my fingers steady, precise, and when the account loaded, I did not react immediately. I simply studied it, the balance, the untouched funds, the quiet proof that not everything had been taken from me, and I felt that same calm certainty return, stronger this time, more defined, because this was not about reclaiming what was lost, it was about understanding what still remained, and more importantly, what they had overlooked. And as I closed the app and leaned back against the seat, the gentle vibration of the bus beneath me, I allowed myself to look ahead, not at the past, not at the locked door or the unanswered calls, but at the next step, the one they had not planned for, the one they believed I could not take, and I knew exactly where I was going. The bus slowed as it approached the downtown stop, the glow of storefront lights replacing the quiet darkness of the neighborhood I had just left behind, and I stood before it fully stopped, my hand already wrapped around the handle of my suitcase, steady, certain, as if my body had already decided before my mind had fully caught up. And when the doors opened with a soft hiss, I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the air slightly warmer here, carrying the distant hum of late-night traffic and the faint sound of a radio playing somewhere across the street, and for a moment I simply stood there, letting the city move around me without needing to rush, because rushing belonged to a version of me that no longer existed, the one who responded immediately, who adjusted, who accommodated, and I was no longer interested in that role, not after tonight. Not after everything had finally been made clear, so instead I turned and began walking down the block, my steps measured, purposeful, until I reached the small brick building on the corner, the one with the narrow glass door and the brass plaque beside it that read Collins and Myers Financial Services, and I paused for just a second before reaching into my purse, pulling out a set of keys that had not been used in months, maybe even years, the metal cool against my fingers, familiar in a way that felt grounding. And I unlocked the door without hesitation, stepping inside as the soft overhead lights flickered on automatically, revealing the quiet office exactly as I remembered it, the same polished desk, the same framed certificates on the wall, the same sense of order that had always brought me a certain kind of peace. And I closed the door behind me, setting my suitcase down beside the chair before walking slowly to the desk, running my fingertips lightly across the surface as if confirming that it was real, that this space still existed, that it had not been taken from me the way everything else had. And I sat down, opening the top drawer without searching, because I knew exactly what was inside, a folder, thick, neatly organized, containing documents I had prepared long before Ashley ever learned how to pronounce my last name, long before Daniel thought he understood how everything worked, and I opened it carefully, scanning the pages with calm precision, the trust agreements, the ownership records, the signatures that mattered, and I felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper into place, because this had never been about holding on to control out of fear, it had been about responsibility, about making sure that what I built could not be taken lightly, could not be redirected without consequence, and as I leaned back slightly in the chair, the soft creak of leather beneath me, I allowed myself a single moment to acknowledge the truth they had overlooked, the truth they had never even thought to question, and that was that the house they had locked me out of, the accounts they believed they controlled, the future they had already started planning without me, none of it rested where they thought it did, not legally, not fully, not in the way that would allow them to move forward without me, and I closed the folder gently, placing it back in the drawer with deliberate care, because there was no need for urgency, no need for reaction, everything that needed to be done would be done in its time, with precision, with clarity, and without emotion, and as I reached for my phone once more, this time not to call Daniel, not to seek answers, but to contact someone who already understood the weight of these documents, someone who had helped me build this structure piece by piece, I paused just long enough to take a steady breath, because the next step was not about confrontation, it was about correction, and corrections, when done properly, did not require noise. They required accuracy, and I had always been very precise. I did not hesitate this time, I pressed the contact and held the phone to my ear, listening to the steady tone as it rang once, then twice, and on the third ring his voice answered, calm and measured, exactly as I remembered it, Margaret, it has been a while, and I closed my eyes for just a brief moment, not out of emotion, but out of recognition, because there are some voices that remind you of who you were before everything became complicated, and I replied just as evenly, it has, Robert, but I need you tonight, and there was no surprise in his tone, no unnecessary questions, just a quiet understanding that if I was calling at this hour, something had shifted, something significant, and he said he would meet me at the office within 30 minutes, so I ended the call and placed the phone carefully on the desk, folding my hands together as I sat there in the stillness, letting the silence settle around me again. But this silence was different from the one outside that locked door. This one was controlled, intentional, and I used it to think, not about what had happened, but about what needed to happen next, and I began to mentally outline the steps, the accounts that needed to be reviewed, the permissions that needed to be revoked, the documents that would need to be executed, all of it clear, structured, precise, because this was not chaos, this was correction, and corrections, when done properly, followed a sequence, and I had always been very good at following a sequence. And when the door opened a short while later, I did not turn immediately, I waited until I heard the soft click behind me, until I felt the presence settle into the room, and only then did I look up, Robert standing there in his usual dark suit, composed, attentive, the same way he had been when he first helped me structure everything years ago, and he took in the scene with a single glance, the late hour, the open drawer, the folder on the desk, and he did not ask what happened, he asked, what would you like to do? And I appreciated that, because this was not about explaining the past, it was about deciding the future, and I reached forward, sliding the folder toward him, my fingers resting lightly on the edge for just a moment before letting go, and I said, I want everything reviewed, every account, every title, every access point. I want to know exactly what they think they control, and he nodded once, already opening the file, scanning the pages with practiced efficiency. And as he worked, I leaned back slightly, watching not him, but the process itself, the way everything I had put into place years ago was now ready to be activated, not in anger, not in retaliation, but in clarity, and after a few minutes, he looked up again, his expression unchanged, but his tone carrying a quiet confirmation, they have access, but they do not have ownership, and I felt that same steady certainty settle in once more, deeper now, more solid, because that was all I needed to hear, and I nodded slowly, my gaze steady, my voice calm as I said, then it is time to make that distinction clear, and for the first time since I stepped away from that house, I understood that this was not the end of something, it was the beginning of something far more precise.